Caitlin and I met what was it, Caitlin, I think 2013, where we were both working at a domestic violence shelter in Framingham through SMOC. So really excited to be presenting with Caitlin today, and I will let her say a little bit more.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm really excited to do this webinar with you all today. So as Brenna mentioned, I've been doing this work for over a decade now. I actually started in this work doing more macro social work, and specifically around sexual violence prevention. And that's how I really got into this field, where I was a research assistant for a college sexual assault prevention program. It was the very beginning of that program, and now it's a nationally recognized one, bringing in the bystander, if you're familiar with it. And since then, I've really done a nice combination of both prevention work and direct service and clinical work. And for me, similar to Sophie, in a lot of my direct service work, I'm a licensed social worker. I've done a lot of counseling with survivors. And I always found it so frustrating to work with all of these survivors and hear the same barriers coming up over and over again, of systems that weren't working for them, or just some of these much larger macro issues that survivors face daily. And so for me, that was really motivation to make this shift into more prevention work and more macro social work. So that is truly where my heart is. I really love doing that type of work. So that is where I am now focusing. And I am currently providing consulting to nonprofits around exactly that. On a personal note as well, I will share that I have a 7-week-old baby home. So very fresh after having my first child. Hopefully they won't be crying during this webinar. So if they are, I apologize ahead of time. But yeah, so that's where I'm at as well.
Sorry, Caitlin, it's Brenna. We're having we have some feedback that your mic's really quiet.
Oh. Is this better if I hold the mic up?
Better on my end, yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. If I forget, please feel free to let me know. I'll try and pay attention to that. So what we hope that you will walk away with today is we hope that you will learn and understand how policy change fits into the larger systems change model. We hope that you will understand after today how to center survivors' voices without the unintended exploitation of their narrative. You'll leave with the best practices in engaging survivors in policy practice. And lastly, what we really hope is that you'll leave with a greater enthusiasm and resolution on how to engage clients and staff with trauma histories in the advocacy process. So that's our goal for this webinar. And so starting off, we wanted to start big picture and macro, and we'll kind of narrow it down as we move on through this webinar. And so when we, as I mentioned, I do a lot of prevention work and a lot of systems change work. And so part of systems change is a lot of different pieces. And so there's cultural change, there's practice change. And for this webinar specifically, we're going to be talking about policies in particular. And so we wanted to kind of be upfront around systems change is this kind of big umbrella. And we're talking about one aspect of that, specifically around policy change. And Sophie will talk about that in a little bit more detail as well.
Great. So let's use the chat function. When you think of policy, what comes to mind? It could be either a phrase or a word or what you think an example of policy is. So let's hear from you in the chat. What do you think when you think of policy? Regulations, guidance and systems, a legislative affirmation of changing times, problem solving protocols that we need to follow, right? That's we're required to. Complicated, absolutely. Just give another minute for folks if they wanted to chime in, but all of these are great examples of different policies. So we see legislative change. Again, yeah, so these are great. So policy can really be any sort of course or action that is adopted and be proposed by really any type of institution. So while some of us may think about legislative, we also heard and saw in the chat that it can also be regulations or guidelines that we have to follow typically as providers, right? Or thinking about clinical setting. So an example I pulled was from Boston Children's Hospital. They have an institutional policy around informed consent. And so this is where sometimes we can see nonprofit organizations or organizations that we work for have very specific policies to that institution that can change. And they typically have their own sort of guidance or hierarchy or board or group of people that are making those types of decisions. The other thing that's kind of an overlay for policy in general is public policy. And that's kind of where we're going to be focusing today. So public policy is a little bit more specific under the umbrella of policy. Now, these are courses of actions that we typically see when the government is involved, or the government is the one who is making these decisions or saying, you have to follow this guideline. So examples of this can be legislative acts for sure, judicial decisions, executive orders, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. So an example I put of a public policy that folks are likely familiar with is the 51A mandated reporter law for children who are at risk of abuse or neglect. And this is something that if you're named as a mandated reporter, you must follow and is set forth by the state government. So because we're going to be talking about policy levers, we want to make sure that we're just level setting, not assuming anyone's previous knowledge or education coming in. So we're just going to do a quick review about what type of policy levers there are. So again, thinking about policy and action and how we can actually make these policies, there are several levers that we as advocates tend to use. One of the most common that I think most people think of when they think of policy and advocacy is the legislative route. This can, of course, be done at any level, including local, state, or federal. Also, as a close partner with the legislative route is the budget route. So budget typically happens on an annual basis, and this is also often an advocate's first introduction to advocacy. It was for me, and maybe for Caitlin as well. When I was at the domestic violence shelter, we partnered with Jane Doe Inc. with their annual lobby day, and we were there as as staffers asking for more money and explaining what that money would go to. So I find a lot of other social workers and advocates, sometimes they work for an organization that's their first interaction with advocacy and policy work. We also can't forget about the regulatory lever. So this is typically other statewide agencies are issuing types of bulletins that their members or the folks that they oversee have to then follow. So an example of this would be, the Division of Insurance issuing bulletins to all of their carriers, basically laying out, this is now what you have to follow, or you need to make sure that you provide this benefit or this kind of cost share coverage. And sometimes we can see these two levers interacting with each other. For example, the legislative branch may tell the regulatory branch, you have to issue this memo, and it's not a choice. But sometimes the regulatory branches will do that of their own accord. So that's where we kind of see another level take place. The third one is executive orders. So this is, of course, issued by the executive branch. So on the state level, that would be for the governor. And then, of course, federal level is the president. And executive orders are another way to quickly get something done because there is not consensus needed. It is a decision being made by a single person. We would hope that that person is taking in the account of what they're hearing on the ground. May or may not be the case. The other issue though with executive orders is that these can be easily reversed when another person comes in to take their place. And so I feel most advocates are choosing for a more permanent route, which would either be legislative or regulatory, so it's actually codified and cannot be so easily reversed. And the fourth piece is judicial decisions. While most folks are not engaging in advocacy per se, the decisions that come down from the judicial branch can certainly play a huge role in an advocate's strategy and trajectory, and thinking about how can we solve this barrier that we've now identified and what would be the best way to do so. So again, thinking about high level, wanted to review the policy process with you of how do we actually get to the place of policy, and what does that mean and what does it look like? So for the first step, we have problem identification. This is probably something that you all are familiar with, whether you are aware of it or not, where through your work, you are seeing or identifying a barrier, a gap in service, or something that just really frustrates you because you said, if this didn't exist, or if we just did this instead, we could expand access and equity for so many more people. And so I think this is something that providers can relate to pretty quickly, is that there is a problem or there's a gap because we're not able to do what we need to do. So second step would be to do policy analysis. So most often these problems are not living in a vacuum. There's likely other organizations, sometimes in other municipalities or states or even countries that ran into the same barrier and the same problem. So trying to do some research, right? What other locations have run into the same problem? What did they do about it? What kind of policy or solution did they propose? And what does that look like? And is that something that maybe it was successful for them? Could we replicate here and do here? Which leads to the third step of the actual strategy and policy development. So after the research, finding something that you want to grab a hold of and you think could be really good for your work and your organization, you start to think about strategically which policy lever that we just reviewed makes the most sense for us to pursue. And this is where you're going to get together like-minded individuals, people with different skill sets and backgrounds, to really make sure that you are, your strength in numbers and that you can utilize all of the different skill sets and backgrounds that you have to your disposal. The fourth step is then policy enactment. And this is essentially it's making it official. You were successful with your strategy and policy development, and is basically either codified into law, it was signed into the budget, or it's now live. But of course, all policy does not stop at just enactment. The fifth step is probably the most crucial step in my perspective, is the implementation. How are you going to ensure that it's being implemented? So if it's a new rule that engages a lot of different stakeholders, how can you make sure that they're on board, that they have their buy-in, and that they're going to do what you set out for them to do? Also, you want to make sure that you are reviewing your policy. Now it's been into effect for a year. Are we meeting the benchmarks and the goals and objectives that we set up? If not, why? And how can we rework that or review it to actually make sure we are meeting those goals and benchmarks? And of course, in the middle is the most important piece, is the stakeholder engagement and education. So you want to be sure that you are including those with lived experiences, those that either are currently impacted or will be impacted throughout all steps of these processes, and also making sure that they are receiving the proper education if they need it about this process, so that they can be fully engaged every step of the way. And then also, you heard me talk about evaluation, which is the yellow, which should also be going on throughout. So in the policy process, of course, well, I guess I'll step back. So white supremacy culture, if folks are not familiar with it, this is a concept that certainly permeates through everyone's work and everyone's organization, regardless of how you identify. And so we also find that characteristics of white supremacy culture can show up also anywhere, even in nonprofit organizations where their mission and values clearly state and delineate about equity and equality for everybody. And so Caitlin and I wanted to take the time during this presentation to talk about what do those characteristics of white supremacy culture look like, And what do we find are the most common that can show up in survivor work? And more importantly, how can we make sure or mitigate that those are not showing up in our organizations? And if they are, how can we know that they are and then take steps to reduce that, that showing up for us? So these are the characteristics of white supremacy culture here. So we have perfectionism, sense of urgency, defensiveness, quantity or quality, worship of the written word, only one right way, paternalism, either or thinking, power hoarding, fear of open conflict, individualism, progress needs to be bigger or more, lack of objectivity, and this right to comfort. And what we find when we talked about this that most often shows up in survivor work are the following. We find that there is the sense of urgency, worship of the written word, paternalism, power hoarding, and that progress must be bigger or more. And just to break it down a little bit more, so sense of urgency is defined as this continued sense of urgency that makes it really difficult to take time to be inclusive or to encourage thoughtful decision making. And this can show up in a lot of different ways at your organization. So I know sometimes there are really quick timelines or turnarounds that organizations have to adhere to for, say, a grant proposal that was just released. And folks would say, you know, it'd be nice if we could include this, or be nice if we could interview these people so that we could get a very well-rounded picture. However, we have to get this deadline churning, and it just doesn't even make sense for us to try. Could be an example of something you yourself have experienced or seen in your work. Sense of urgency can also look like sacrificing the interests of communities of color in order to win victories for white people. It can also be reinforced by funding proposals, which promise too much work for too little money. So sometimes it may feel like we need to have this, very public acknowledgement of our work, and we understand that it might be a burden or stretch our staff too thin, but it just makes sense for the organization that we have to do this. So worship of the written word. If it's not in a memo, it doesn't exist. Or asking, can you send this by email? Sending things or writing things down to cover your tracks, taking notes during meetings, making sure there's minutes. Deliverables can also be an example of this, thinking concrete, and offering no space or room for any sort of other situation. And so because of this, those with strong documentation and writing skills are more highly valued. And the organization can also not take into account or value other ways in which information can get shared. So usually very rigid and concrete guidelines around this. Paternalism. Decision-making is clear to those with power and unclear to those without it. So even if we're striving for a very equitable workforce, this can sometimes show up in terms of power differential that really isn't explained to everybody there, but everyone can feel it. It's kind of, I feel like it's when you were maybe in high school and you knew who the popular kids were, and maybe they knew who they were popular to, but no one really understood how it happened or what that actually meant. And it was kind of this intangible that people weren't able to explain. Then there's power hoarding. So those with power feel threatened when anyone suggests changes in how things should be done in the organization, and feel that any suggestions for change are a reflection on their leadership. So thinking about the insecurity here that lies with leadership, it could also, instead of just a single person, it could be, a board, it could be a larger group of individuals that's kind of feeding into this, which then leads to individuals not feeling like they can make any suggestions or that their suggestions won't be heard, and so they stay quiet. And then progress is bigger or more, typically observed in how we define success. So the bigger the success, the more powerful we are, the bigger that we're seen. And that progress usually can be defined in an organization that expands. We're getting more staff, we're adding more projects, or we're able to serve more people. So thinking more about the quantity rather than the quality of the services or programs that are put out there. And we of course want to be able to, serve more individuals, but if it comes at the cost of the quality of the services, that typically can happen when we're thinking about these different characteristics. So now we're going to transition into a breakout group for all of you to talk and share with each other the following discussion questions, and Caitlin's going to put the link in the chat. The questions we want you to discuss are, which of these characteristics do you see at your organization? And you don't have to use names, you don't have to introduce your titles. And if you know folks at your agency, you can, of course, kind of talk about this at a more, macro or anonymous level. But think about which characteristics are at your organization now, or maybe at an organization you used to work for. And what can you and your community do to shift the beliefs and behaviors to counteract these white supremacy culture characteristics and support racial justice? So we're going to put you into the breakout chats now. Caitlin just put in the Google Doc. It's not an editable Google Doc. It's just for you to be able to look at the characteristics and the questions at the same time. And we'll probably take about 10 minutes in your breakout groups, and then we'll come back together. And if folks want to share any high level things, they can. But of course, if you want to keep that to your breakout rooms, you're able to do that. So we will have Charlotte put you in the breakout rooms, and then we'll see you in 10 minutes. So now Caitlin's going to talk about how policy connects with survivor support.
Thank you. So yeah, I am assuming that most, if not all, of you all who are part of this webinar are involved in survivor support in one way or another. And, we've so far have been talking about policy, and we want to kind of make it relatable to you and your roles. And why are we talking about policy in regards to supporting survivors? Well, first of all, policy impacts survivors. Anybody who has worked directly with survivors knows that. Policies are related to issues that survivors experience because they're humans, right? And all of us are impacted by policy, and survivors are no exception to that. On top of that, we as advocates and professionals in this field must help shift those policies if we want to change the systems and the cultures that perpetuate violence. So going back to one of the first slides around systems change, is if we actually want to change these systems and prevent violence altogether, we have to focus on policy. It's such a huge part of systems change. And lastly, survivors can impact policy, and they do impact policy. And so that's kind of the purpose of this webinar, is to talk about how to empower and center and lift up survivors to be able to continue impacting policy. And there's a lot of really great examples of how survivors have impacted policy. And so thinking about Larry Nassau with the U.S. Gymnastics organization, where survivors came forward and shared their stories of being sexually assaulted by the coach, Larry Nassau, and they spoke up and they helped shift some policies within the U.S. Gymnastics by sharing their stories. Also looking at military sexual assault, there's a lot of progress that still needs to be made, but there has been a lot of changes within the U.S. military around military sexual assault, and that is 100% due to survivors coming forward and sharing their experiences of being sexually assaulted in the military and how the military has handled or mishandled those cases. Also looking at Me Too, which then resulted in Time's Up, that is completely survivor-led. And even getting outside of sexual assault, even talking about police brutality. I mean, it's still in the news. It's continuously in the news because it's such a huge problem in this country. And any slight progress that has been made has been as a result of survivors who are coming forward and sharing their stories and pressing charges and lobbying with their local representatives and federal policymakers And even thinking about like ending no-knock warrants after Breonna Taylor was murdered. And so there's so many examples of how policy has been directly impacted as a result of survivors. And so we can't do policy change without survivors being there at the table, and helping to institute those changes. And part of how survivors can impact policy is through the role of testimony. And so I'm going to pass it back to Sophie.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so all wonderful examples about how testimony has played a huge role in really these momentous events. The other thing I'll say is, I think eventually we want to be working towards a place where we don't have to put survivors in a place where they have to disclose their story in order for change to happen. But it is certainly a very important role right now, and I think is one of the most accessed ways. And so we're going to talk about what that role looks like, how you can support survivors, and again, engaging them in a way that's not exploitive, and that makes them feel empowered to be able to share. So we're going to watch a brief clip in just a moment about Amanda Nguyen. So she is the CEO and founder of RISE. In 2013, she was sexually assaulted on campus here actually in Massachusetts. She said that she wanted to press charges at a later date, but then learned that if she didn't file for charges then, that her rape kit would have been destroyed within 6 months. So she decided, this policy doesn't work for me and it doesn't work for survivors like me. So I'm going to take it to the federal level to see if we can change it.
Do you accept injustice or do you rewrite the law? I chose rewriting the law.
Amanda Nguyen is the founder of civil rights startup RISE and is a Nobel Peace Prize nominee for her work on behalf of sexual assault survivors. She was forced to navigate intense legal barriers after surviving rape, but she penned her own civil rights into existence when she passed the Sexual Assault Survivors Bill of Rights. I sat down with Amanda to discuss her playbook for change and why her fight for social justice is far from over.
The worst thing that happened to me wasn't being raped. It was being betrayed by a broken criminal justice system. In the beginning, it was just about survival. In moments of trauma, it's this fight or flight situation. And for me, it was, okay, so I found out that my rape kit could be destroyed in 6 months before even being tested in Massachusetts. What was I going to do about it? So I remember walking into my local area rape crisis center, and there weren't enough seats for us in the waiting room. And I thought to myself, if I have a Harvard law professor as my attorney, she's one of the best in the nation, and we're still struggling this hard, what is everybody else doing without my resources? And that's when I realized, okay, it's rewriting the law. Anger can fuel, but it cannot sustain movements. It's hope. It's having something to look towards, and it's having, quite frankly, return on investment of your energy and your effort. And so to that end, we developed a sexual assault survivor Bill of Rights, which had has some key components, very common sense, basic civil rights. It includes the right to not have your kit be destroyed before the statute of limitations, the right to be notified of your rights, the right to have access to your own medical record, very, very basic. And it ended up passing unanimously through the United States Congress.
We're going to now jump into some of these best practices, which many of you have already brought up. And I assume many of you already know many of these. But the first one is exactly what you just mentioned, which is allowing the survivor to share their story in their own language. And this may include having an interpreter translating after they share. We know that if you have to share something in a language that is not your native language, that things can get missed, or you may not be able to accurately portray the message that you really want to get across. And so it's so important to be able to provide those resources for the survivors to share in their own language, in the language they're most comfortable speaking in or communicating in. Along those lines, broadening the invites. Don't just select the quote unquote easy clients. And I know that language is kind of provocative, and it's provocative intentionally. As someone who has spent many years doing direct service, I know we all have our favorite clients, right? We have the clients that we have great rapport with, or they may be easier. They don't challenge us too much, right? And so those can be, it can be easy to reach out to those specific clients because you already have that rapport built up to them. And I think it's important to really assess and look at who you are inviting to share their story or to be involved in policy change. And maybe just putting out a broad invitation to all the survivors that you're working with, and not necessarily targeting the invites. And so I think that's really important, because that also helps solve the next problem, which is avoiding diversity picks. We want to be sure not to exploit folks for their stories, for their pain. And we do want to lift up diverse voices, voices who have a wide variety of experiences. And so be intentional not to pick folks just for diversity bonus points, right? But and broadening the invites can actually be really helpful for that. And making it safe and comfortable so that anybody who wants to participate is able to. And so continuing on, and I think this is so important, valuing and compensating their time and their narrative. This is, again, so important to not exploit survivors for their pain. But how can you compensate them? There's a lot of different ways to do that. Cash stipends, covering lodging or transportation if they have to travel, gift cards, whatever it may be. And if possible, like talking to the survivor about how they would like to be compensated and giving them a say about that. If you give them a Walmart gift card, but they never shop at Walmart, it's not going to be relevant to them. And so that's part of centering them in this process and compensating them in a way that actually works for them and values their time. It's also really important to set expectations and boundaries ahead of time. Who's going to be doing what? Who's going to be saying what? Are you going to introduce this person? Are they going to introduce themselves? If there's any pushback, if anybody has talked about these issues with folks, like there's often pushback, or people have follow-up questions that may be victim blaming, for example. And so who's going to be intervening in situations like that? Is it going to be the staff person? Is it going to be the survivor? Is it going to be somebody else? And being upfront with these expectations ahead of time can be really helpful in supporting the survivor. Continuing on with that, and I'm sure I don't have to say this, I'm sure all of you here know this, but meeting the survivor where they're at in their own healing. And I think this is two-sided. And so don't assume what supports they may or may not need, or when they need them. And I think a lot of times when we say this, we mean that to really be there for them and support them and take care of them, and also knowing they may not need that at all. And that's part of not assuming what supports they may or may not need. I think it's important not to assume that survivors are fragile or that they need coddling. Yes, they may be sharing their story or their experience, which may be really difficult, but that doesn't mean they can't do it, right? And for many survivors, that's actually a very healing process for them. And to not be coddled is what they need the most. And they may just need their space and to be able to do that. And so having those conversations with survivors around what they need or don't need in that moment is so important. And it's going to change for each survivor. And so you'd have to have this conversation with hopefully you'd have multiple people, as we talked about, and not just tokenizing one person. And so having this conversation with every single person that is involved in the process. And just as a reminder, staff are survivors too, which sounds so obvious, especially thinking about the statistics. Yet, at least in my experience in working for domestic and sexual violence organizations, I think this is often forgotten. And staff are often expected to come to work and put their survivorship to the side. And a lot of organizations have policies that reinforce this, such as you can't volunteer or work if you're also receiving services there. And so a lot of times staff are encouraged, whether directly or indirectly, to kind of push down their survivorship and not bring that to work, which we know is not possible. We can't just hide or put away one of our identities or put away our experiences to do the job. And I think this is also part of the thinking that survivors are fragile and vulnerable. You can't do this work if you're also a survivor, right? But we know that's not true. We know that this movement has been led. It was started by survivors, and it continues to be led by survivors and should be. And so just as a reminder, when you are reaching out and wanting to bring in survivors to help shift policy, to think about your staff too, because they may want to also be part of that process and bring forward their own survivorship and their own experiences to that process as well. And there's a lot of really great examples of this being done. And so, for example, Ayanna Pressley, Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, she has openly shared about her experiences with sexual assault and uses that experience of hers to shift policy, either directly or indirectly related to survivors. And she does a really great job at towing that line between working and getting the job done and bringing her survivorship forward during that process. Another example, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who recently shared about her own experiences with sexual assault. And once again, has used those experiences to shift policy herself. And then also State Senator Joan Lovely as well has also done a great job at tying or towing that line. And so that it can be done and it should be done. And so this is just a reminder to also welcome and embrace your staff's experience too, especially if they want to be part of the process. And also don't exploit their time either, right? Because it can be easy. Oh, you already work for us. You're already going to get paid. So here, let's put you out there instead of paying for somebody else because we don't have the money, right? And so considering how can you compensate staff as well for sharing their experiences outside of compensation they may already be getting. And so I've mentioned a few times about how survivors are not fragile and often don't need coddling. And so we want to play this quick clip about Elizabeth Smart, who I'm sure many, if not all of you, are familiar with. But if you're not, basically, when she was 14 years old back in 2002, she was abducted from her home and she was held captive for 9 months. It was a highly publicized event, and the media shared her story a lot. And she has since done a lot of activism around survivors as a result of her experience. So we're going to play a very quick, I think it's like 2 minutes clip of her in an interview.
And I remember one of the things that he kept stressing, because every time a child is returned, we often go to your dad and talk to him, and he says that it's important to let the person who has survived and come back in their own time to talk about what's happened. Do you think that's true?
Being with my family, it couldn't have been any better. I mean, I couldn't have asked for a better dream come true or wish come true, wish granted. But then to have so many people speculate on what happened and what I must be going through and just so many, well, lies being told. It was hard. I didn't like it. I don't think anybody likes having people guess at what they're going through. Privacy is so sacred, and anytime a victim is returned, a survivor is found and rescued, privacy is one of the greatest gifts we can give them, because if they decide to share, that's up to them and they will come forward.
I talked a couple months ago to Sean Hornbeck, who was also abducted and returned finally. And one of the things he said has always stayed with me. He said, "This is something that happened to me. It's not who I am." Does that resonate with you?
Absolutely. I'm not just that girl that was kidnapped. That happened to me, but I'm so much more than just that girl that was kidnapped.
And your life now?
I couldn't be happier. I've been married for 1.5 years. I mean, I've got
You got
a
married
wonderful.
in Hawaii, right?
Yeah. I mean, couldn't get better than that, right? I've got great dogs. I've got a great family. I mean, I couldn't be happier.
We want to just open up a quick discussion around how can we honor that a survivor's experience is just that. It's an experience and does not make up their entire self. And so feel free to type in the chat, or if you want to unmute and kind of share what thoughts you have. We'll take a couple minutes to hear what you all think.
And while folks are thinking, I can share my personal experience. So I've done work on survivor speaker bureaus and, sharing my own personal narrative. And I always felt very honored as a survivor when folks would say, thanks so much for being here and, sharing your time. Is there anything we need from us before we start? No. And then we just shifted to a topic that was not about me being there to share my story, and just acknowledging, what work do you do? What do what are hobbies and activities that you like to engage in? It seems really simple, but for me, it just was like, thanks, that was a part of your life you're willing to share with us today. That's wonderful. Now we can move on and talk about something else. So just wanted to share that as folks were brainstorming.
Thank you, Sophie. I can give another example. I worked with a survivor for many years, and they really loved photography. And so we actually applied for a grant to get them a camera and flashes and backdrops and like all of the camera equipment that they would need. It had nothing to do with them being a survivor. It was just a passion of theirs. And so we applied for a grant to help lift up that passion of theirs. And so even thinking outside of the box can be really important as well. Great. Thank you all for sharing. And so now what, right? So we shared all this information. We started macro. We talked about policy and what that means and what that looks like and the different levers. And we talked about some best practices. But what can you do now that you have this information? And so look for planned advocacy days. Jane Doe does an advocacy day every year, which is a great event. I've participated in it multiple times. It's a really great way to get involved in policy. And there's a lot of others as well. And so, participating in Jane Doe's as well as some other planned advocacy days. And some are directly related to domestic and sexual violence, and some are sort of adjacently related, and those are just as important as well. And you don't have to wait for these planned events to participate. You can schedule meetings with your local representatives outside of these planned events. Is there a bill that is moving through the process that you're really passionate about and you see the impact that it's having or could have on survivors? Schedule a meeting with your representative and talk about it. And I know we've been focusing a lot on public policy, but also our organizations have policies too, right? And so it can be important to look at your own organization's policies. Do you have a policy that exploits survivors, whether intentionally or unintentionally? Do you have policies that don't center the voices of survivors at all? And so maybe just doing an analysis of your policies. Or maybe you have policies that prevent staff or discourage staff from sharing their own survivorship, right? And so doing an analysis of your own organization's policies can be a next step that you can take. And part of that is, where are you centering survivors in your own organization? Are survivors involved in decision-making processes, or are they only utilized to share their pain, right? If survivors are only welcome to the table when they're sharing their experience, then it may be helpful to think about other ways that they can be involved as their full selves. And so, do you have survivors on your board, in staff? And are those survivors involved, again, only to share their stories, or do they have other roles as well? And as I mentioned, we know that our organizations have survivors as part of them, but are they able and encouraged, or at least allowed to have the opportunity to share their survivorship in those roles? And lastly, amplify the work that is being done by survivors on the ground. Survivors are doing such great work outside of survivors or services that they're receiving. And again, maybe it's activism around trauma. Maybe it's something completely different. Maybe they started an organization or got a community group together. And so how can we amplify the work that's being done by survivors on the ground? And just again, another reminder, we talked about white supremacy culture at the beginning, but be mindful and ask, am I carrying any characteristics of white supremacy culture as you engage in this work? It's something that we all have to constantly be thinking about and reminding ourselves about. So we wanted to be sure to end with that reminder. I'm sorry, my cat is in my office and wanting to leave, so you might be yelling. So with that, what questions do you all have for Sophie and I?
I guess I'll make the obligatory joke that I guess you and I were just that thorough. We'll still take the time to type in any questions if you have them. If not, feel free to reach out to myself or Caitlin on any of this content or anything we want to pick our brains about for any of our other work. And we do have a question. What is the recommended first step to have a survivor get involved in policy change? I have some thoughts, Caitlin, and then I can turn it to you. I think the first step is the education, to let survivors know, in addition to the clinical services and other resources that we're providing you here, there is another route that a lot of other survivors have taken, and you can share those different options with them, but also educating how the system works to demystify it, to make them feel like, oh, this is something that I could totally see myself doing, so that they're not, I guess, dissuaded or put off by it. Because, when you talk about testifying to somebody who's never engaged in that process before, it can feel really scary. And then that person says, there's no way I could do that. So I would say education first and foremost.
Yeah, for me, I think it depends. I think it depends on, is there a policy that you want to involve survivors in changing, or do you have a survivor coming to you and saying, hey, I want to do something about this? So I think those have different approaches. I think if it's kind of your initial idea and you want to bring survivors in on that process, I think doing some of the organizational assessment about who are you going to reach out to? Why are you reaching out to those specific people to involve? What type of voices do you want at that table? If it's the other way, I think absolutely what Sophie shared, like demystifying the process for them, and talk about how can you support them? What do they need? Having that conversation, and what resources do they need to be able to participate in this process, and just kind of having that conversation with them. So I think it depends on the starting point, but there's lots of different avenues around that. I hope that answers your question. So Tori asked, can we change what mandated reporting looks like? So often victims and survivors are punished and re-traumatized by the state under the guise of protecting children. Yeah, that's another policy, right? And so I think, there's lots of different ways to change that. And I think we could absolutely see more advocacy done. I can't speak for individually myself. I don't work for DCF or anybody else that would be able to specifically change that. But I think advocacy, absolutely. Like, yeah, I don't know, Sophie, do you have?
Yeah, I certainly can chime in. So this is actually a very hot topic right now, because so in the state legislatures, there is the Joint Committee on Children and Families, and they are currently looking at the mandated reporting law right now. I think Maria Masades and from the Office of the Child Advocate, and there's a lot of legislators as well who are just very passionate about child protection, are currently looking at how do we make this law more, I think, defined. And when I've spoken with them, they always point out Pennsylvania's law as something they've wanted to replicate. I can't remember the details of it, but I'm saying this to say, reach out to your own state legislator, find out from them what current changes are being discussed, because this bill is on the move, and then share your expertise and your experiences to help shape that conversation. So definitely reach out to your own state legislator. And if you don't know who they are, going to wheredoivote.ma.com is a great way to find out.
I will say any policy at all can be changed. And some are bigger than others, and some may be more of a fight, but every policy can be changed. And so that's always a great reminder, because it does often seem overwhelming, or what's the point? We're never going to see this change, but we still got to advocate and fight for the changes that absolutely need to be made. Any other questions at all?
Caitlin, don't forget your microphone, your voice.
Thank you. Thanks for the reminder.
Jamie, thank you for your comment. Exactly. So they're looking at enlarging on who are mandated reporters. And so to Tori's point, and saying, hey, really appreciate what you're doing, but I think you're missing some crucial things here. Let me share with you my experiences and where I think the conversation and discussion needs to go. And also, here's a list of organizations and people that I know would be more than willing to talk to you. State legislators are very well-meaning. They know a little about a lot of things, and that is what they've said to me directly. And so they need to hear from the experts on the ground and people with lived experiences in communities, so that they don't make those well-meaning mistakes.
Any other questions? Feel free to type in the chat, or if you want to unmute and ask, you're welcome to.
Otherwise, thank you all for joining us this morning. We really appreciate it.
Since we aren't seeing any other questions come in, I will just say thank you very much to Sophie and Caitlin. And I do want to let everyone know that we will be sending out this PowerPoint as well following today's session to share with you all. And this was recorded as well, so it will be accessible on our YouTube channel. I believe Charlotte just dropped in the chat. We have a feedback form available that we'll send via email as well. We encourage you to fill that out and let us know what you thought. And then I'm just going to invite you all to our Victim Rights Month events next week. It is the last week of Victim Rights Month. We have 3 events, so we encourage you all to join. And thank you again to Sophie and Caitlin.